problem and the concept of the assemblage. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and try to explain why I think that is interesting. Okay. So the concept of the assemblage, which, as I was saying the other day, in French originally is agencement. So when you hear people saying assemblage, you know that they're being pretentious because, in fact, it's not assemblage. It's an English word. But the problem is assemblage is kind of a bad translation because it's using a French word in place of another French word, so it doesn't really clarify things too much. So I have always thought that the better translation would be something like arrangement. Now, because nobody uses the term arrangement, I will continue to use assemblage, but if we can pretend that we're Derridian for a moment, you can write assemblage and then cross it out and in your mind write arrangement. And then you'll kind of be getting into the vicinity of what I want to talk about. Now, the origin of the term assemblage, or arrangement if you like, in one of the first translations of Felix Guattari's book, which was called, what was it called? Molecular Revolutions or something like that. He had to produce a glossary in English to translate what was meant by the term assemblage and desiring machine. And he said that it was a replacement term for complex, okay, as in the Oedipal complex, okay? So one of the other ways you can begin to think about the concept of the assemblage is by relating it to the notion of the complex, particularly the Oedipal complex. Now, I don't want you to think it's only the Oedipal complex, but the idea of a complex. Now, if you remember your Freud, the complex for Freud is simultaneously symptom production and the attempt at a cure. Okay, like you have the complex because on the one hand you have a kind of an issue that you're trying to deal with, but on the other hand the complex is a kind of solution to that problem. Okay, so if you remember the Oedipal complex has a number of different moves in it. The key one is that the child must learn to renounce the mother as their primary love object, but they must also resign themselves to the idea that the father is the major figure of power and so forth. So the complex consists of an arrangement, if you like, with desire. Okay, renunciation of one object, resignation before another object, and therefore a status quo. Now, in Freud's view, until you get through your Oedipal complex, until you reach this point of resolution, you are going to be unhappy. You'll be neurotic in his terms. So the resolution of the Oedipal complex is an assemblage. It is an arrangement with desire. Okay? And importantly, it's an arrangement with desire that enables you to live in a particular kind of way. Okay? Now, what was interesting for Freud is that he always thought that desire should try to achieve a steady state, that it should be basically static, and he talked about this as being like the nirvana principle and the reality principle and various other terms that he had. But his general view was that stimulation, internal stimulation from desire, was generally perceived to be problematic by the psyche. Okay, like too much stimulation made us agitated and neurotic and so forth. So therefore, the idea that Freud had is that we are always trying to come to an arrangement with stimulation. Okay, and for Freud, that stimulation is coming from within. Okay, and that's also important to what Deleuze and Guattari are talking. So in our first ways of thinking about the assemblage, we're thinking about the relationship between something that we might want to call the psyche, just for the sake of argument to begin with, and in the internal stimulus of desire. So in other words, if you're thinking about your everyday life and you're thinking about a day when you're feeling, let's say, really, really stressed about something, you know, your thesis is due, 100,000 words due by Monday, you haven't started writing it, what are you going to do? This is a familiar story to me. I've supervised more than 30 PhDs, practically no excuse that I haven't yet heard. But nonetheless, that produces a certain kind of stressful situation. So, what do? Binge eating, watch Netflix until your eyes fall out, take amphetamines and start writing. One way or another, you respond to that situation. But what you're responding to is as much the fact that you have to get this piece of work done by Monday as all the internal stimulus that is coming up as a consequence of your knowledge that you actually haven't done it. So what we think of as stress, what we call stress, is internal stimulus, okay? And that's what we have to try to make an arrangement with. That's what the assemblage does. The first form of the assemblage is an arrangement that deals with the internal stimulus, okay? And there are many, many permutations of this, and we can come back to those as I further elaborate. All right, so you're with me so far? Any questions? No? See, there you go. Full bottles already. Okay, so to complicate things further, Deleuze and Guattari never thought it was the case that you could invent one concept, or rather they never wanted to invent one concept where they could invent 20, and certainly they never thought that there was a single concept that could stand on its own. Okay, so that is the case for the assemblage. Okay, so the assemblage has a history. It begins as something like the desiring machine, morphs into desiring machine, becomes assemblage, and that's more or less its final form. In interviews they were asked, or they talked about why they abandoned the concept of desiring machine and replaced it with the idea of the assemblage. And the answer that they gave, this was at a talk that they were giving in Italy, and they said, look, we thought too many people knew what we were talking about, and so we decided to change it. Now, they didn't mean that they wanted to confuse people, although it definitely had that effect, but rather what they were worried about was a kind of dogmatic application. Okay, so like contrast what Deleuze and Guattari tried to do with, let's say, what Zizek is trying to do. So Zizek, and I don't mean this as a criticism, he would absolutely say this is what he's doing, and there's various places in his work where he does say this, but Zizek is interested in a dogmatic interpretation of Lacan and a dogmatic interpretation of psychoanalysis. What I mean by that is, for Zizek, no matter what situation you are confronted with, there is an answer in the playbook of psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis, if it's a good theory, must be able to respond to every single situation. Okay? Now, Deleuze and Guattari take the opposite view. They say, well, if we're trying to apply something dogmatically, then our concepts are not going to be fitted to the situation. Because if the situation is genuinely new, how could we apply an old concept that was constructed in a different time, under different conditions, for a different set of problems? So our concepts then should be constructed in relation to the problematic. Okay? So in other words, when they said they thought people were starting to understand them too much, what they meant was people were starting to try to apply their work in a dogmatic way. Okay? Now, for us, trying to understand Deleuze, that makes it pretty difficult because surely as we are trying to understand their work, we are also trying to apply it in a dogmatic way as well. To which I have to say, in the first instance, yes, we are, because if we haven't figured out what they're actually trying to say, then we can't really do anything with it. But by the same token, if we take on board the idea that we need to invent and to modify our concepts in relation to our situation, then we're never actually going to be applying it dogmatically. Okay? And so one of the ways that I've always thought it useful to think about the assemblage or to think about schizoanalysis as the broader rubric under which they work is to see it as an incomplete project. Okay? Like in their own lifetime, in various interviews, they always said, you know, we're only just getting started with this. We haven't really finished figuring all this stuff out. So it's an incomplete project. Now what that does is give you license to take the concepts and to see how would they be applied in a new situation. Okay, so like we were talking earlier about Bollywood film, there is nothing within what Deleuze-Guattari wrote that could automatically just be transposed onto Bollywood film to start talking about it. But there are plenty of things there that you could pull out of it and recombine to try to create a new model that would enable you to talk about Bollywood. Okay? So the way I would suggest that we should think about using Deleuze and Guattari is always in this sort of experimental way. Understand it dogmatically, get a sense of what they're actually trying to say, but then give yourself license to reconstruct, recombine the elements in order to understand a new situation, one that they hadn't previously been able to consider because it was not possible for them. You know, like obviously Deleuze and Guattari didn't write about Facebook. The internet did barely existed when they died, but nonetheless we should be able to use their work to talk about Facebook and the internet and so forth. And one of the things, I mean, I wrote a paper about this like a million years ago, saying that we have to be really careful with dogmatic application, because we can't just look at the internet and think, oh well, that must be a body without organs because it, you know, it's a machine, not a real body, etc. It's a really kind of lazy way of trying to apply their thought. So Deleuze and Guattari always say the foundation or the starting point is to develop the problem. Okay, Deleuze says in his book on Nietzsche, philosophy has the concepts it deserves according to the quality of the problems it constructs. The problems do not just fall from the sky, they have to be constructed. Okay. And so what I was trying to do as I was talking about Facebook and other things is to begin to think about what kind of a problem is Facebook, and how might we then begin to think about it, how might we begin to analyze it. And partly what I was suggesting is that Facebook is a problem of social engineering, that we should begin to see it as a way of constructing, forming, shaping, influencing society. But we should see that it runs much deeper than simply something that we approach as being like a, just a screen. Okay. So, any questions?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Actually, I want to ask this question at the very first, but then I couldn't do it. Actually, when I'm applying to the English, because I think to an extent that we should rather engage with some of these ideas. But when I'm applying on the Indian context, especially in the context of say social movements, anti-capitalist type of social movements, I'm encountering certain problems, and every time people say that you shouldn't do this. And the reasons they show for that is that first, say the context of the capitalism in the Indian context, and as you said, it's an incomplete capitalism, right? It couldn't have that kind of a transition, right? And also because of the the sheer diversity of the accumulation processes, which one David Harvey simply cannot explain. So you need various ideas of how the accumulation processes are going on, the land questions are going on, and the whole diversity of say the production chains in the Indian context. So given that we didn't have a transition, given that we have this kind of a very heterogeneous type of accumulation processes acting within the same field, thirdly that we have this sort of diversity of production chains, and these production chains often intersect each others, and they do not really qualify as capitalist production chain as a whole. So and lastly that we do not have complete subsumption of capitalism, the capitalist machinic ensemble as such in the Indian context, because there is something always non-discursive, non-capitalist movements existing in the Indian context. So non-capitalist affectives are very operative also in certain contexts, even though they are not very absolutely non-capitalist, but they are movements at least which are always transcending the capitalist.
So
how to think of Deleuze
in that respect?
Like this?
Yeah. So
especially in the anti-capitalist movement.
right. So I mean, I think that the answer is kind of to be found in the first couple of chapters of 1,000 Plateaus, with the notion of strata. So maybe we'll use this then as the jumping point to talk about the next concept, which didn't necessarily have to be strata, but why not be strata? So what do they mean by strata? So strata, as you would guess, is taken from geology, and it's an image of the different layers of rocks and so forth through time. And so archaeologists and paleontologists and geologists are forever, digging holes down to the ground and telling you that this is from the Jurassic era, this is from some other era, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Now, the problem with this idea of strata you'll remember in Freud where he says, we could think of the unconscious as being like the city of Rome, in which there are layers of history, and so you've got the Colosseum standing out, but buried beneath the Colosseum, there's a whole bunch of other temples and so forth. So he says, some parts of history are showing, some parts of history are not showing. And then he says, very interestingly, the problem with this model is that the unconscious is not static, that there is nothing to stop something that is presently buried from erupting into the present and overturning things. So we need to have a dynamic model of stratification. Okay, so we need to think about strata. We need to think about how we can separate out layers of things that are different. Okay, that life in the big cities of India are quite different from life in the villages. So to lump those people in together and say they're all the same would clearly be false. So we do need to be able to separate them out. But by the same token, we can't, or we wouldn't want to assume that the boundaries between the strata are impermeable, that nothing can go between the two. So very simply, you might say, well, let's take religion. Religion is present both in the village and in the city. So there's something that passes between the boundaries, okay? So when we start to talk about strata, then effectively what we're trying to talk about is how could we map something that is complex without losing the complexity, but by the same token, making visible the problematics that we want to talk about. So that, in a sense, is the point of strata. So how would we understand strata? Well, strata you might define as being an assemblage that has become irreversible. Okay. So all assemblages in their normal modality are dynamic and changing and moving on, but some assemblages have become or do become irreversible. So, for example, Deleuze and Guattari give the they talk about F. Scott Fitzgerald's short autobiographical piece, The Crack Up. And in The Crack Up, he talks about his own life, and particularly his own life as an alcoholic, right? And of having reached certain moments in his life where he recognized that his life was cracked, that there was something about his moment now that meant he could not go back, okay? That things had become irreversibly broken. And this is kind of what I was talking about the other day when it was sort of, kind of in a humorous way, talking about if you have a breakup with your girlfriend, your partner, or whatever, that is irreversible. That for you is an experience of the irreversible, that your previous assemblage has now become irreversible. You can't go back into that assemblage and turn it around. Even if you get back together, it's not going to be the same assemblage. There's always going to be that issue for you to deal with for the rest of your relationship and your life. So we can think of strata as irreversible, or assemblages that have become irreversible in a particular kind of way, lost their dynamic dimension. And so some things like, like religion or village life and these things, we can say these are strata. It's not that they're not changing, because they do change, but there are some dimensions that have become fixed and they can't keep changing. Like, religion changes, sure, but it changes very slowly. And there are dimensions to it that are irreversible. So, for example, if you're a Christian, you might start thinking, as most Christians do right now, that even though the Bible says if your wife cheats on you, you should stone her to death, most people now think that's probably a bad idea. I don't know if there are any real literalists out there who think, that's it, woman, I'm stoning you to death right now. But if they were truly orthodox and dogmatic, they should, So I'm very suspicious of anybody who doesn't. But what's absolutely irreversible is that you can't think, well, look, I don't even think believing in God is necessary to be a Christian anymore. I mean, what an old-fashioned idea that is. So you can't do that, okay? So the point about stratas is that they have irreversible dimensions, or you might say inflexible dimensions, that points past which they cannot change, and that these are widely recognized. So if you're doing the kind of work that you're talking about, then what you're wanting to look at is how do I map the things that are fixed in a certain kind of a way, and at the same time, how do I start to mark the things that are mobile and that are moving between them? So, for example, people moving from the country to the city, what things do they bring with them? What things do they leave behind? And there's been lots of historical work done on this, for sure. So it's a new way of trying to conceptualize that particular modality of history, and also something that you could then spread to other kinds of conversation. So in an aesthetic dimension with Hollywood and Bollywood, you could look at the different ways by which you'd be able to absolutely say this film is Bollywood, this film is Hollywood, but nonetheless there are filmic techniques that are mobile between those two things. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah. So it's a difficult question to answer, because the thing that we do not want to say is that the situation is simply given. Okay, so the situation is not simply given. It's not like you, the anthropologist, conceptualist, whatever, go walking around the world and the world is given to you and you can start analysing it. So we can't say that. So what we have to say is that whatever we are considering to be the situation is in some way already the product of our own perception of it. So what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to say to us then is that we need to be conceptualizing our perceptual process just as much as we're trying to conceptualize the things that we are perceiving. And so in a sense that's what schizoanalysis is designed to do. And the assemblage then is really a perceptual apparatus. Okay? It's as much a thing that occurs in the world as it is our way of seeing that thing that occurs in the world. And that's what makes it a concept. Does that make sense? Yeah? Any other questions? Okay, so the assemblage does not stand alone. And the strata is, one should say, just a kind of a variation of the assemblage. It's not a distinct concept in its own right. But there are three concepts within Deleuze and Guattari that are absolutely essential and must always be thought together. Okay, so we've got the assemblage, and I always refer to this as the Holy Trinity. You have the assemblage, you also have the body without organs, and then you have the abstract machine. Okay, now these should be seen as going together in the same way that Peirce's semiotic triads go together. You know, icon and symbol and image and so forth. Those three things, they're inseparable. Okay, you cannot think of them as being, I can have this one or that one or that one. Ask me.
Yeah, so you mentioned three concepts: assemblages, abstract machine, then what was the other one?
Body without organs. Yep. So I'm going to define the other two for you now. Okay, so body without organs then, again a concept that has a long history within Deleuze and Guattari's work. It first makes its appearance in the Logic of Sense, okay? A very, very small passage in the Logic of Sense, where we learn that the concept is actually taken from Melanie Klein. The word comes from Artaud, but the concept comes from Melanie Klein. So it's important to make this distinction, because a lot of people think, oh, it's just, it comes from Artaud. Completely wrong. Comes from Melanie Klein, okay? So Artaud has the poem where he says he wants to have done with the judgment of God, and he wants to have a body without organs, which for Deleuze then presents the problem of, well, what does he actually mean by this? What does he mean by organs? What does he mean to have a body without organs? And so he turns to Melanie Klein and he says, well, Melanie Klein has two kinds of objects. She has the anal object, and then she has the liquid object. Now the anal object within psychoanalysis is fairly well studied. It's the object of obsession, etc., etc. But he then says, but she also has this idea of the liquid object, which nobody ever really talks about, including Melanie Klein. She herself never really spoke about it. But what did she mean by this? So he proposes that the liquid object is a way of thinking about a form of, if you like, psychic absorption, whereby the sort of in Shakespearean terms, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune are absorbed. He says you can imagine it as being like a giant liquid wall. Okay, so what he's saying is then that Artaud, when he talks about he wants to have done with the judgments of God and to have a body without organs, is saying that the organs make demands on his body, and he wants to have done with them. And so he wants to have like a liquid body in which those organs cannot penetrate and they can't make demands on him. Okay? Now, if you recognize that what he's talking about with respect to Artaud is somebody who was borderline schizophrenic. I mean, there's no clear clinical diagnosis for what schizophrenia is anyway, but let's say he was schizophrenic. He was also an opium addict, so whether it was schizophrenia or the result of opium use, who knows. But either way, his existence was built around the fact that from within his own psyche, it made demands on him. Remember the other day I was talking about schizophrenia, hearing voices inside your head. Okay? So if we think about what it must be like to hear voices inside your head, then what are your options with respect to those voices? Either you obey them, and we call that psychosis, or you find some way of absolutely ignoring them, and we call that catatonia. Okay? So the first form of the body without organs was catatonia. It was this liquid wall stopping yourself from receiving this stimulus and finding some way of getting some peace, of not being disturbed anymore by this particular kind of stimulus. Okay? So in the first form of the body without organs, it was what we might think of as being a fairly negative concept. Negative in the sense that it was diagnosing a particular kind of problem. Now, over the life of the concept, it changes, and by the time you get to 1,000 Plateaus, it's become a more affirmative concept with both a negative dimension and an active and affirmative dimension. Okay? In Anti-Oedipus, which is the first book that Deleuze writes with Guattari, it's still largely a negative concept. Okay? And it was the concept of the body without organs that first drew Guattari to go and talk to Deleuze. Okay? So the way that their relationship came together, Deleuze had had a lung removed, he was convalescing in the south of France, was thinking about writing a book about schizophrenic language because he'd already started to write some things about nonsense in the logic of sense. He got in touch with a former student of his who had been a medical student and studied some philosophy with him and was now working as a psychiatrist at Laborde. And he got in touch with him, and this guy said to him, look, I don't really know anything about it, but you really should meet Guattari because he's just the guy for you. So anyway, they subsequently got together, and evidently it was the meeting of true minds, and they agreed to work together. And their working process, apparently, according to how they have recorded it, was the two of them sitting together in a room. And apparently the rule was, and this is an interesting idea for an assemblage, the rule was that you weren't allowed to ask questions. You just had to keep talking. If it was your turn to talk, you just had to keep talking and talking and talking. And then they would reverse roles. It's quite an interesting idea that you didn't interrupt the flow of conceptual production. But also at that point, Guattari didn't do any writing, so Deleuze said, look, you've got to start writing every day. And so Guattari would send him a page of notes every day, and Deleuze more or less ignored all of them and then wrote his own book and sent Guattari the manuscript, and Guattari marked it up and sent it back to him, and he ignored that too, and then published the book. So it's an absolutely amazing model of collaboration and tremendous power of trust. And people have criticized it all the time, and one of the things that Deleuze and Guattari have said about that is that it's because people do not understand collaboration. They don't understand collaboration. They don't understand what true friendship looks like. So one of the things that's always attracted to me to 1,000 Plateaus is this model of friendship that underpins this tremendous creative collaboration where they shared ideas and trusted each other to write it up and so on. All of that's kind of an aside, I guess, but nonetheless, getting back to the body without organs, in Anti-Oedipus, the body without organs is said to be a kind of automatic production alongside desiring production. Okay? And thus they start to see the body without organs is presented as a form of counter investment. So desire invests in something, but there is also a sort of counter investment coming back that tends to sort of quell desire, and if the counter investment becomes too great, you end up in that sort of catatonic situation all over again. Now they must have been unhappy with this as a model, a bit too kind of mechanical, And so as we move into 1,000 plateaus, the model changes again, and it enters a new kind of a phase where it's now more or less the premise, the starting point of all desire. And what they say is that all our practices are designed or have the purpose of producing a body without organs. Now, this body without organs can no longer be the negative catatonic body without organs of the previous iterations. So how then should we understand it? And this is something that I have to admit has puzzled me for a long time, and I have spilled many gallons of ink trying to figure out what the answer to this question might be. But in some ways the solution is kind of staring us in the face all along, because if what we're trying to do is to produce a body without organs, and if our desire takes place on the body without organs, as they say, then the body without organs is the condition of possibility of our desire. Okay? The condition of possibility of our desire. Or, as I also like to translate it, as the experience of pure possibility. Okay? So what do I mean by pure possibility? Well, think about that time when you're standing in the shower, water's coming down, and you're feeling really great, and in your brain you have just written the perfect Indian realist novel that's going to be once and for all. It's the Nobel Prize. It's amazing. In fact, it's so amazing you don't even have to write it. I mean, it's just like it's done. It's like in your head. It's beautiful. And it's like amazing, and you just keep having a shower, and you're there for like an hour later thinking how good this novel is. And then you go to your computer, you sit down, and you go, fuck, where's it gone? My beautiful novel has gone. So, but think about that moment in which you had written that beautiful novel. That is pure possibility, okay? Because it's not affected by the realities of having to sit down and write this stupid 500-page book. It's not affected by any of the problematics of thinking, well, what will I actually say in this book? It's an experience of pure possibility. So my hypothesis, if you like, my proposition, is that if we begin to think about the body without organs as that, and that's what our practices are designed to do, if we get our assemblage right, we can stand on that feeling of pure possibility. And our goal is to try to prolong that feeling as much as possible. Recognizing that it's not always possible, recognizing if you would probably have to be medicated to walk around on that particular bubble non-stop. But on balance, what we're trying to do is to experience that more often than not. If you go back to my original discussion around the idea of stress, what is stress if not the profound feeling that you have been blocked from your feeling of pure possibility? That everything that you experience as stress, you experience as something that is pushing you back from the feeling of pure possibility. Okay? And what you try to do, the assemblages that you come up with, are all designed to try to pull that possibility back into view. Or, alternatively, they're designed to divert you away from even wanting to do it. So that's when you think, oh, screw it, I'm just going to watch Netflix, it's impossible anyway. But you know that you're kidding yourself, but nonetheless you're trying to push away this powerful counter-investment that stress is, and take yourself off into a different kind of pure possibility, which is sitting there watching Netflix like a zombie for 2 days. Now, what Deleuze and Guattari say then about our notions of desire is, I think, really interesting. And if you start to look at it in terms of this idea of pure possibility, you can see that it actually is embedded in their work in a number of different places. And one of the examples that they give is of the alcoholic. Okay? And they say that the alcoholic is trying to calculate, and they call it an economics of everyday life, that the alcoholic is trying to calculate what he call, or what Deleuze and Guattari call, the second last drink. Okay? So this is a drink at which you can stay drunk without collapsing or passing out or something like that, or becoming too drunk. Like there's always that sort of it. I'm assuming that all of you are very well behaved, so you don't know this. So because I'm the kind of person who has done the hard yards of doing the research, I will, kind of let you in on this moment. But there is always a moment when you've been drinking too much beer and you sort of think, oh, damn it. But you've gone past that drink where you think, yeah, I've really got to go home now because actually it's all going to get ugly. And sometimes you forget to go home and then things get ugly. But with experience, over time, you learn, yep, it's time to go home. So this idea of a sort of economics of everyday life, this second last drink for us can be thought about in terms of all relationships, right? Think about that time when you're having a fight with your best friend or your girlfriend or whatever, or your boss, and you really want to say something, and you just, and you know in your mind that there is something that you could say, but it wouldn't be the second last thing you ever said to them. It would be the last thing you ever said to them. So in other words, in your fight with your girlfriend, boss, or whatever, you are actively, constantly looking for the second last thing you could say that's not going to end the relationship, but nonetheless is going to let you get that. So this way of thinking about desire then is about thinking about the body that organs as this feeling of pure possibility and a recognition that this pure possibility is fragile, that it has to be maintained, that it has to be managed, that it has to be actively constructed. Okay? So it's quite different from psychoanalysis. It's quite different from an idea of the unconscious as being something that's just kind of there. What they're saying is, no, we actually have to constantly construct it all the time. And it's not something that is ever simply there. Okay? Now, the other thing they say, and referring back to the example of the alcoholic, is the problem with the alcoholic is that they try to arrive at their body without organs by what Deleuze and Guattari call unsustainable means. So it's a kind of false body without organs. Okay? And thus they quote Henry Miller, who says, you know, what we should try to do is get drunk on pure water. Okay? And what they mean by that is that it should be a sustainable form of desiring production, if you like, one that does not require the stimulus of chemicals and so on and so forth. And so one of the kind of built-in questions within this idea of the body without organs is what they call a notion of health. Okay? And they're quite specific about saying that there are healthy and there are unhealthy, in fact there are even like cancerous and deadly forms of bodies without organs. And so one of the things that we should try to map under sort of schizoanalysis is the kind of relative health of different bodies without organs. And one of the key criteria for that mapping is how sustainable is it? What are the conditions of its possibility? Do you need to take drugs to do it? Do you need to drink alcohol to do it? Do you need to run marathons to do it? Also just as crazy. Do you need to, you know, do dangerous things, etc., etc. Okay, so what are the conditions of possibility for your body without organs, and how sustainable is it? And that can help you to determine whether or not it's going to be healthy or not. And they are very, very sort of cautious and insistent, if you like, to say that there are forms of body without organs that are suicidal, that lead you towards the idea that the only way by which you could obtain your pure possibility is through a notion of death. And in interviews, they both said that they started to arrive at this idea because a number of their students during the course of the years they were writing it had suicided or died from drug overdoses and so forth. So they began to say we really need to think about this notion as something that we need to be cautious about. Now the other aspect of the body without organs is that the body without organs is the point of which the assemblage changes. Okay, so they always say the assemblage is standing on top of the body without organs, but the body without organs is always the possibility of transformation within the assemblage. Okay? All right, any questions up to that point? No?
No, actually, I thought that body of that's sort of, I think, my misunderstanding of your book also. I thought that body of without organs is about an ideal utopian where the possibility where you want to imagine a system where the organs lack. I mean, by organs, I actually try to understand the power, the power blocks, right? The power blocks that in a way block you to, acquire that possibility. So it's a kind of say an university where you don't have the VCs, you don't have all these power blocks which often works as an encumbrance, right? I mean,
yeah.
Which, limits you. So I thought of a kind of a possibility of that sort where powers doesn't really block you. Is that
No, absolutely, but that would not be realizable, right? So that image of the university that doesn't have power blocking you at every turn would be precisely a kind of image that you have constructed. But it's not simply a fantasy, and it's not simply sort of a utopian pipe dream. I mean, what they're trying to say is that without that image of pure possibility, you wouldn't be able to function. So, in other words, this way of thinking about pure possibility is a sort of subterranean kind of confidence and hope in the world that you know that there are blockages out there, but you also have this strong feeling that somehow you can navigate them, that they are not as kind of terrible as you think. And again, what I was talking about with respect to stress is that when they start to feel like you can't get past those blockages, that's when you've sort of slipped off your body that augurs as pure possibility, and it started to take a different kind of a turn. Now, in the sort of therapeutic discussions that Guattari has in his sort of separate work from Deleuze, in a sense, what he's always talking about is how do you get back to that pure possibility? What new assemblage could you come up with that would enable you to realize this feeling all over again? Yeah.
That is a subjective arrangement.
Sorry, would you say that again?
That is a subjective arrangement you mean, that the individual has to cope up, sort of thing.
So, sorry, are you?
possibility of agency?
Yeah.
Is there possibility of agency?
Change of the surrounding situation.
I can creatively change. She was talking about create
Or
new
it indicates
affects.
personal responsibility of adjusting.
Yeah, but I mean, I have to go back to talk about the assemblage in more detail later, but if you think of the assemblage as being an arrangement that you make with your situation, then yes, there are the possibilities of change. But by the same token, changing how you feel about something is just as powerful and just as important as actually changing your material circumstances. So for example, a trivial example, if somebody says something to you and you're kind of like, I don't really know if that was really bitchy, were they being kind of, were they being nasty, or did they really not mean anything by it? And, you really don't know. And so in psychology, they call this reality checking, okay? So reality checking is to go back and think, well, are they the kind of person who really would have said something nasty like that? Or is it likely that it was, them just being a bit kind of hasty in what they said? I'll come to you and say, a bit hasty in what you said. And then you were able to say, okay, I think they were just being a bit hasty and they probably wouldn't have said anything nasty. And you've sort of reality checked. But what you've done is change your perspective on that. So you've got back to a position whereby that particular kind of, barb was no longer important to you. And for Deleuze and Guattari, that's really what's fundamental. And as they talk about this in the Thousand Plateaus, they say the fundamental thing that we have to do is change perception. And remember, they're writing about schizophrenics, right? So schizophrenics are constantly being bombarded by things that are very difficult for us to understand because we can't imagine what it would be like to see things that, to our way of thinking aren't there, but for them, they are there. So how do you change perception? So that's what's at the core. But by the same token, as you move that into history, changing perception is also fundamental to changing the physical assemblages around us. You think about my example with respect to religion and Christianity and not stoning your wife to death anymore. That's a change of perception, right? It's a change of perception in your relationship to a text that you are supposed to respond to dogmatically. Very, very powerful kind of change of perception. Yeah. So is there agency? It's kind of a false question because the question of agency always assumes that there is a person who has agency to do something. And the whole of new materialism as a kind of model of talking about things has sort of picked up on the fact that one of the things that Deleuze and Guattari are talking about is that agency is distributed. And it's not necessarily your agency as a subject that matters, but the agencies that are possible in your interactions with other subjects, interactions with things and so forth. So in a way to say, is there agency is a false question. Is it subjective? Is similarly a kind of a false question because, as they argue, the subject is a product of the assemblage, not the other way around. The subject doesn't inhabit the assemblage, it's a product of the assemblage. So yes, it is subjective, but the subject arises out of the assemblage. Okay? Right. Right, your question.
All right, so this issue of, what are we changing? Is it perception? Is this the actual material relations? I wanted to ask you about this, the part of A Thousand Plateaus where, in talking about the body without organs and sort of, how to make it and all these things, Deleuze-Guattari they have this moment's kind of vacillation. Okay, how do we do, and it's in relationship to the idea of experimentation, right? And they say, they use this metaphor, sort of, is this really, do we put our bodies in danger, or do we stand on the shore? And it seems like those are the two models. Like you've got, is it perception, right? Are we changing perception? Are we doing this through a sort of a thought process or some kind of, or is it really sort of do we need to sort of literally kind of get off the shore and sort of experiment with the body? And I mean, I wonder, I think it's both, and both, right? But are we doing different things? So is it necessary to experiment in the body in that way in order to really kind of understand what the conditions of possibility of the body without organs are? So is it a kind of like, is that what's going on in that kind of that?
I mean, the short answer has to be no.
Okay.
Because it's not necessary to experiment with the body, because
Advocate it.
but it's not necessary. That's a different kind of statement.
Right.
So it's not necessary because experiments can take place purely in a sort of psychic universe. It doesn't have to be the body. But nonetheless, the experiments with the body can also then produce effects on the mind that might be beneficial. So the stuff on masochism, for example, is how can we use the body in a particular kind of a way in order to achieve certain kind of psychic effects, which are, the kind of an arrangement with desire.
One final, and then I just wanted to, what you said about perception. How would you? So I'm thinking about the relationship between sort of the sensation and the sensible, and perception and logic of sensation. So I mean, because there it seems like there really is a kind of, and maybe this is because of my proclivity towards art and sort of creating sort of sensible sort of encounters or something like that. But it seems somehow I feel like it's not sitting well with your reading or something, that this is about perception, solely. How do you figure in art then, and what he says in Logic and Sensation about sort of this sort of I don't know if it's a privileging, but I kind of think it is. But sort of this desire to actually put ourselves in sort of in these kind of sensible encounters that do in fact kind of change perception, I think.
Doesn't that answer your own question?
I know. Well, I want to know what you think about it. I mean, do you? I guess.
Well, I think that art is capable of changing perception. Yeah.
Yeah, I want further development. Suppose there is a authoritarian regime, repressive regime. Suppose, for example, a Jew under the Social Democrats. So how would the Jew, which have changed perception?
Sorry, I didn't.
Suppose that a Jew under the Social Democrats, or might be under a Jew under Hitler's rule.
A Jewish person?
Yeah, under Hitler's rule. Okay, suppose, for example, a person living under a repressive authoritarian regime. So, how he can,
How the change
How
of
the
perception will
identity
change
will
the
change.
material condition.
Why does it have to be a Jewish person? So it sounds like the start of a bad joke.
Or for example, a minority living under a repressive ITist regime.
Oh, so you're thinking about this in terms of the Holocaust or whatever? Look, I'm not saying there's any kind of magical formula here. Jewish people got gassed, and it didn't matter whether they changed their perception or didn't change their perception. And it's false for us to think, well, if they'd been in contemporary parlance, they'd been more woke in 1933, they would have left Europe and got themselves off to America. But that was not possible. Sorry? Yes, exactly. I was just about to say that even the ones that did try to get out weren't necessarily able to get out. America didn't want Jews then either. And so not all of them got out. So some of them went to England in the first instance. The Brits weren't too happy about it, but nonetheless they took a few of them. So Adorno, for example, taught at Oxford for a while. Apparently he absolutely hated it. Can't blame him, right? So yeah, so it's not a magical solution by any means. And one of the things that they also say about revolution and so forth is that for the most part, we don't see it coming, you know. Revolutions change perception, but they don't necessarily begin with us changing perception. Like, we don't always know when a revolution is going to come or what form it is going to take. So I'm really suspicious of various models of cultural studies that want to say that, you know, it's sufficient just to change perception. I'm not saying it's sufficient. I'm saying that that is, in a sense, what they're trying to find the means for us to conceptualize and to talk about. But there are still other things that need to be done, and revolutions don't happen just because you change perception. Because if they, you know, as Deleuze said, you know, very famously, if all it took to change people's minds was, you know, to show them the truth, then it would have happened already. But it hasn't, right? So it takes more than that.
I think here there is this concept of becoming with becoming, where I remember where he was talking about that the minorities must become minorities, the blacks become blacks. So it is not something which is given or kind of changed suddenly, but becoming remains open or operating with that openness also, where it can happen, but that doesn't mean that it has already happened or kind of outside absolutely in that sense. But I feel the becoming part is now coming in relation to Thousand Plato's and also later in particular Rafi also.
Yep, yep. No, that's absolutely right. All right, so the next one is the idea of the abstract machine. So we'll complete the trilogy, and then I'm going to go back and talk about the assemblage in more detail because it is more complicated than I originally led on. So the abstract machine is, again, one of those concepts that's quite elusive, and you know, you might wonder why they even have to have it, and why do they even talk about it as a machine. I mean, it would be a lot easier if they didn't call it the abstract machine, to be quite honest. That creates a lot of confusion, but nonetheless, that's the term that we are given with. So what do we know about it? Well, the one thing they say about it, first of all, is that the abstract machine plays a piloting role, and it plays a piloting role in relation to the assemblage. Okay. They also say that the assemblage is the realization of the abstract machine, and that the problem with the abstract machine, from our point of view as people doing cultural research, is that it's rarely abstract enough. Okay. So some of the complaints about Deleuze and Guattari have been that they're too abstract. Their reply would always be, you can't be too abstract. In fact, it's not possible to be too abstract. We are always failing to be abstract enough. Okay? So this is a kind of a problematic for us. What does being abstract enough actually look like? And how might we get to that particular kind of point? Okay? So let me try to explain what they mean by that. If we go back to the body-without organs, the next evolution in the concept of the body-without organs, right? So by the time you get to the end of 1,000 plateaus, this concept has already been kicked aside. You know, it's a bit like, you know, the image of the ladder. You climb up the ladder, you get to the next level, and you kick the ladder away, and you no longer require it. By the time you get to what is philosophy, there's no more mention of this concept of the body-without organs. The term that survives is plane of immanence. So in other words, you could totally ignore the body-without organs as an idea altogether, and if you focused on the idea of the plane of immanence, you would be perfectly fine. Okay? And so what I'm talking about as pure possibility is in fact what immanence looks like. Within a pure state of immanence, you have pure possibility because there is nothing within that immanent field that could interrupt that pure possibility. Okay? Now, pure immanence is difficult to think about, and we need some kind of an image to get our sense of what it's like. And I've always taken from Deleuze's quotation from Leibniz, where he said, you know, I thought I'd found safe harbor, but I in fact found out that I was all at sea. If you try to think about immanence, think about it first of all as being like on a boat, if you like, on a featureless ocean. Okay, so you're out in the middle of the Indian Ocean, hundreds and hundreds of miles from shore, no islands around you, nothing. Okay, now obviously you've got the sun above you and stars and everything, but let's for the moment forget that they're there, and you're just looking on a two-dimensional plane, looking at the ocean. To most of us who are not trained as navigators, there is nothing on that flat expanse of water that could tell you where you are or how you are going, which way you're going, any of those kinds of questions. Okay. However, if you are a navigator, you begin to see that your featureless landscape is not featureless, and you can begin to navigate your way. But as you do that, you are progressing from pure immanence to constructing transcendental elements within that pure immanence that you are now going to use as your markers. Okay? Kind of like we imagine if you are a non-religious person, you imagine that at some point in history, humans were standing around thinking, well, this can't be all there is. There has to be something more than this. I know there must be a God. And people sort of argue about it. What kind of a God is it? Well, I don't know. He probably looks like that. It does this, it does that, whatever. So God was invented. And you can say, well, they were in a state of pure immanence with respect to the idea of the divine, but then they wanted to create transcendental elements, and they called it God. And then God had some rules that were laid down, and so on and so forth. So Deleuze and Guattari's model of the formation, if you like, of human thought across history is something like that. It begins in a state of pure immanence. Out of that arises transcendental elements that become fixed, that become like the coordinates of our thought. Okay?
Is it transcendental or quasi-transcendental?
I mean, those kinds of arguments are not terrifically interesting, and for my purposes, what I'm trying to do here, not that relevant. It's just simply we're moving from something that is a state of pure immanence to something that's not pure immanence. And you can kind of figure out whether you want to call it quasi or whatever at a different time. But what I'm moving to is now to get towards the abstract machine, because the abstract machine is, for Deleuze and Guattari, like the plane of organization. Okay? So one of the other things that they call the plane of immanence is the plane of composition. Okay? Go back to my analogy about writing the perfect novel. What is that moment of writing the perfect novel? It's to be on the plane of composition, to understand how you're going to compose this great thing, to understand how it's all going to fit together, is to be standing on the plane of composition. Okay? So on the flip side of the plane of composition is the plane of organization, and the plane of organization is ultimately the set of rules that you cannot negotiate with. Okay? But by the same token, those set of rules are also your possibility of change. Okay? So one of the ways by which we can begin to think about the abstract machine is the abstract machine is the set of material, physical, ideational realities that you have to negotiate with, that you have to understand in order to be able to realize your body without organ, for your possibility to be possible. And so this goes back to your example and to your example about the sort of ideal city and so forth. That's what the abstract machine is. As you start to imagine all the roadblocks on the way to being able to achieve your view, you are in the realm of the abstract machine. You're beginning to think about, well, what would this machine look like? And so, you know, you think about Jameson's writings on utopia. And one of the things that he says about utopia is most utopian authors, the thing that they want to try to come up with is a kind of blueprint for how do we get to utopia. And one of the most kind of common means of getting to utopia is to imagine massive destruction. You know, you think about Hollywood films, we say that they are dystopias, but they're not necessarily dystopias. Because how do you get to a better world? Well, first of all, you blow up this crappy one, and then you imagine on the flip side of that things are going to be somehow utopian and fantastic and amazing. So we cannot assume that destruction is necessarily a dystopian way of approaching things. In fact, it could be utopian. We might say from a Deleuze and Guattari point of view that this is an unsustainable way of attaining your, you know, pure possibility, but nonetheless it doesn't mean that that's not what is at stake. So the abstract machine then is your way of mapping your roadblocks, of beginning to see the things you would have to, in your view of things, you would have to somehow come to some kind of arrangement with. Okay? So you've got three concepts. You have the assemblage, you have the body without organs, and you have the abstract machine. They are inconceivable without each other. Okay? And you make a mistake if you try to separate them out and talk about them separately and individually. For the sake of argument and for your sanity, you do need to try to this one, and this one. But you always have to remember that they are in this dynamic relationship. And in Deleuze and Guattari's language, one is always turning into the other in any case. Okay, so it's a kind of fluid cartography where you're trying to map something that isn't three-dimensional. Okay, like you can map a house, right? Three-dimensional house, you can map that. But how do you map your dream? How do you map your fantasy? How do you map your way of feeling about the world? How do you map your way of feeling about, an issue right now? That's what we're dealing with. Like if we want to talk about really important topics like, why did Trump get elected? Why is Modi still in power? Etc., etc. These kinds of questions can't be answered in any straightforward way. Requires us to map multidimensional, highly complicated, highly contentious, what in some languages is sort of thought of as being competing priorities, that we balance this one against that one and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, any questions on that? Yeah. Hang on, I'll take this one in the back.
So when you spoke about pure possibility, and this pure possibility is fragile and it's trying to make modifications within the assemblage. Deleuze and Guattari refer to pure possibility or this possibility as something which is self-emergent, or it's rather always happening within the assemblage. Because you're talking about pure possibility as if it's like a eureka moment that comes to you in the shower that okay, I've tried to solve everything, no matter if it happens in the reality or not. Because there is this idea of pure possibility, but there is another idea of immense possibility. Like for example, we are always trying to unleash the poets, as if like we always try to. I mean, the idea of feral children, we fantasize it in form of Tarzan. It's not that you're constricted within an assemblage, but there is a pure possibility of being able to do anything. It's an immense possibility. It's not that pure possibility that you're talking about. So,
But possibility wouldn't have a scale, right? So pure possibility has no scale. It's either the small. It can be both the smallest thing that you can imagine and the biggest thing you can imagine. You could be imagining that you are going to bring about world peace, just as you can imagine that you have finally figured out how to answer the question for a Sudoku puzzle. So scale isn't relevant to the concept. And in answer to your first question, no, it's not self-emergent. It's precisely not self-emergent. I mean, the whole point of it is that it requires experimental, practical activities on your part in order to bring it into being. They do talk about it as being autopoetic, but autopoetic is self-sustaining, not self-emerging. And Donna Haraway gets this wrong. It's not anything to do with emergence. It has to do with self-sustaining. And so autopoetic is it reproduces itself using the resources from within itself.
Clarification, I'm asking you. You're talking about the possibilizing of a possibility, right? So which is a kind of a doing. Now, can we say that the plane of immanence remains operating like a continuous operation of the possibilizing of possibility and the possibility that possibilizes itself?
Well, you do have a way of trying to find words that you can turn them inside out. So no.
On the one hand,
No, the short answer is no. I get the question, but the answer is no. It's not, the body of that organs as an operative entity is not continuously in operation. As a possibility or as a concept, it's always available, but because it is something that has to be practically realized, it's not always available for us to practically realize because the practical circumstances may or may not facilitate that. So conceptually, yes, it's always there because that's sort of the nature of the concept, but practically and in the reality of our daily lives, no. Some of us may say, we never find our body organs. And others may say, well, yeah, I've always kind of got mine under control. So it's not constant, it's not continuous. Is it possibilizing? I don't know if that's necessarily the right word, but certainly in terms of thinking of it as a condition of possibility, one might say that that's in the ballpark of being the right word. But for me, I'm not. I mean, one of the things that I was trying to say at the start is that Deleuze and Guattari was saying, let's not be dogmatic and fetishistic about words. So for me, I'm okay with that being mostly kind of the right way of putting it. But I'm also happy with it to be kind of something that we would change in time.
At some distance, in that sense, if I say it remains
No, not a distance, right? It's always there. It's always possible in the conceptual sense, but it requires practical activities to realize it. You know, in exactly the same way that the perfect novel in your head is right there, but you got to go write the damn thing. So it's not distant from you; it's right here, but you have to write it. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, the plane of
Oh, yeah.
sense and plane of immanence, know the difference between these two. Because in plane of sense, he sounds quite structural almost. I mean, he's talking about how plane of sense can be built. But in this concept, I think it's
But the plane of sense is from the logic of sense, right? So it's sort of a kind of a prior and different kind of a concept. So I think we have to be careful about trying to bring those two things together, because in many ways the plane of immanence and the plane of sense are kind of the same thing, because the sense is possible within the plane of immanence. But I also tend to think that it's one of those occasions where we don't necessarily want to try to combine those two things. I don't think we should assume that Deleuze's work evolved organically, so that there is some necessary line of continuity from book A to book B. And that's kind of what I was trying to say. From the logic of sense, the body without organs is a fairly negative concept, but by the time you get to Anti-Oedipus, it has completely morphed into something else. So we can't, I mean, when I've written about the body without organs, I've always said we can't treat it as one kind of continuous concept. In some ways, you have to say it's the body without organs before 1,000 plateaus, it's the body without organs after 1,000 plateaus. Quite different kinds of things.
Duetter is, collaboration with Deleuze. I think Ricky has also written on that how he's shifting towards social ontology. This last two books.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always suspicious of anything that says, oh, was this Guattari's influence? The short answer has to be yes, because, why else would they collaborate, and what else would the collaboration have done if not enable them to produce new things? But then we should also be suspicious of all those kinds of accounts that say, oh, well, but Guattari corrupted him and, took him off in some other direction. This is what Zizek and Badiou say, right? So, I don't like those arguments at all. And was it moving away from, something to something else? I don't think so. I mean, I think Deleuze was talking about something quite precise in logic of sense, trying to understand a particular kind of effect, if you like. And then they started to ask a different set of questions when they got to 1,000 plateaus, or Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 plateaus. And then they started to, recycle, re-engineer, repurpose their concepts for a new set of problematics.
In the last lecture, if possible, could you please relate to some of the objections that guide this has?
Oh my God, it's been years since I've read that. It was one of those books, one of those articles which I read and was just like, threw it across the room. I don't even remember what her arguments were. I remember thinking they were beyond stupid and not worth actually engaging with. But if you want to give me the propositions, I will be happy to try to deal with them. But yeah, no, it's been ages since I read it. I was so infuriated by it. I was just like, what?
Can you say what you or how you understand that when they talk about the deterritorializing effect of the abstract machine? Like, how would you fit that in, and how would you explain that in terms of the way that you?
And if I could add to it, how would you explain reterritorialization?
Well, I mean, maybe this is a lot to ask of you at the very end of the thing.
All right, I'll tell you what. I'm going to take a 5-minute break and give my brain and body some refreshing. Literally 5 minutes. Like if you spend 35 minutes out there talking, that's fine. But I'm leaving the building at 1 o'clock, okay? So I'm going to take a 5-minute break. I'll come back and I'll give you the answers to these questions. The whole enchilada. I did say I was going to leave you all, experts when you left, so that's a noble ambition, I feel. So, territory. Again, a kind of a complicated concept, and one that has a fairly complicated evolution within the concept of their work. I have found that one of the best places to begin to think about the idea of territory. Oh, we have some territory action happening here right now. set of interviews that were recorded about 5 years before Deleuze died and published as the Abécédaire. In the first interview, called A is for Animal, Deleuze obviously talks about animals. He famously says that he doesn't like cats. He hates the way they rub up against him. But he says, but he likes the way they seem to know how to die. Evidently his cat died in recent memory or something, and he was in admiration of it. Bear in mind he was dying too. He also says, somewhat scandalously, that he thought that dogs were particularly stupid, and that the bark was the stupidest of cries, and in fact that it was the shame of the whole animal kingdom. And so you can sort of understand why Donna Haraway might have been somewhat incensed by anything that Deleuze might have had to say. But in amongst all that, he says that he's quite interested in the concept of the territory, which relates to or comes out of animal behaviour studies. Now, the first thing to think about with respect to territory, and this is something that I have to confess I've only really lately started to pay attention to myself, is that not all animals are territorial. Okay, there are basically two types of animal. There are gregarious animals and there are territorial animals. Okay, so sheep are gregarious. They just hang out in a big old flock of sheep, all stand around being sheep together, being, you know, really happy little sheep. Okay, but at certain times of the year, territorial behaviour does come in, and of course, you know, they're fighting about who gets to have, you know, sexual relations with who, and thus territorial behaviour comes into being. Okay, so gregarious animals can become territorial, but not necessarily. Territorial animals can become gregarious and so forth. So the first thing we want to think about with respect to territory is that territory is a modification of behaviour, and fundamentally it's a modification away from gregarious behaviour. Okay. Now it's an open question whether or not we would say humans are fundamentally gregarious, or are they fundamentally territorial, or, which is much more likely, that there is some kind of a mix between those two things. And there's been some very interesting experiments around this. Garfinkel in the 1950s, for example, used to do what he called breach studies, and he used to get his students to, for example, to go onto an elevator, and particularly an elevator in which there was only one person, and get into the elevator and deliberately stand next to that one person. You know, get right up next to them like that, and stand next to them, and see how they responded. Now, this I think must be very cultural, right? Like, you know, my experience of being in India is that much more comfortable with people being right on top of you, which would not be tolerated in Australia. People would get really uncomfortable. So Deleuze does talk about this. He says that, you know, within territory there is a kind of species distance. That we're comfortable being a species distance. That there are, you know, some things that we're comfortable being close to, some things that we are not. So what he's saying then is, and what Garfinkel was interested in, is what provokes territorial behaviour. Okay, and would it be different under different circumstances? So if you imagine, you know, you're a guy and it's a very beautiful, and you're heterosexual, and a very beautiful woman comes into the elevator and she comes up and stands really close to you, you're probably going to be mostly okay with it. But if it's, you know, a handsome guy and you're not homosexual, and he comes up and stands really close to you, you're probably not going to be comfortable with it. So in other words, territory is complicated by a number of factors. We can say sexuality is one of them. There would be others. If we reverse the situation and say now we've got a woman standing in the elevator and a guy comes into it and stands very close to it, you know, you can already see her tweeting "Me Too." It would be experienced quite differently, right? So then you have not just sexuality, but now the threat of violence or of physical presence or something like that. Okay, so our idea of the territory has to be thought in terms of what kinds of physical processes or mental processes set it in motion. Why do we become territorial? And then what is the nature of the territory? What are the things that provoke it? What are the things that manage it? And finally, what kinds of things might cause the territory to to relax. Okay. Now, one of the things that we learn from animal behavioral studies is that where the territory is in place, animals behave differently inside the territory from when they are outside of the territory. Okay, so when the lion is in his territory, he behaves one way. If he decides to go on a long hunt and goes, outside of his own territory, perhaps entering into somebody else's territory, he acts in a completely different way. In his own territory, he's all macho and get out of my space. Goes into somebody else's territory, and he's kind of like, it's cool, it's cool. Doesn't want to provoke other people because he's not in his space. Okay. So that's what's true for us as well. When we're in our territory, but we behave one way. When we're in somebody else's territory or not in our territory, we behave another way. Think about how you behave in your bedroom. Clothes are optional. Go outside of your bedroom, having to walk around the street, well, things have changed. Things that are okay in your bedroom, not okay out on the street. Very, very mundane example, but nonetheless important, right? So one of the things if you travel, when you get home and you say there's nothing better than my own bed and being at home, all of those things are territorial comforts, if you like. These are the comforts of being in your territory. So we might also say then that territory has to be thought in terms of the benefits, or what sociologists and psychologists call the affordances that they provide. Because otherwise, why have a territory? Okay, territories don't exist for no reason. They must produce some kind of a benefit for us. So Deleuze and Guattari's hypothesis, if you like, and I don't know if this is right. So I think what I'm saying is right, but I don't know the limits of what I'm saying. But they seem to be saying something like all human behaviour can be understood as territorial. Now, it's the part where I say all human behaviour that I'm opening up some doubt about. And the reason why I'm doubting it, it's because it's not clear whether they are saying that, but it's equally not clear that they're not saying that. That they don't really place any limit on where territorial behaviour would stop. So for argument's sake, let's say it's all human behaviour. But they extend it beyond human behaviour, so obviously to animals, but also even into aesthetics. So aesthetics can have a territory as well. So what would it look like for aesthetics to have a territory? The best example for this would be something like music. Okay? Think about a melody. Okay? A melody marks out a territory. Okay? The question is, what can you do, what can you vary with that melody before you've destroyed your melody? Okay? How much variation can your melody withstand? Okay? Now this is the notion of the refrain. So one of the ways by which we can think about the refrain is already a territorial function. Okay, so the ways by which, one of the ways by which a territory is created is through the notion of the refrain. The refrain is a repeated piece of music. It's repetitive and it constructs a sort of intellectual space, if you like. Okay, but it's also a creative possibility, because you can come up with this melody and think, well, what can I do with it? How can I vary it without losing control of it? Okay. So this is the process of deterritorialization, the process of leaving my territory. Okay? Now, you can leave your territory in 3 different ways. So there are 3 forms of deterritorialization. In the first instance, there's a relative form of deterritorialization, which is you think you are leaving it, but actually you're not. Okay? The sort of women's magazine version of this would be to go from one bad boyfriend to another. You've never changed your territory. You've only, in a relative way, left. You've only relatively deterritorialized because you haven't actually achieved change. Okay? The second form is an absolute form in which you do achieve change. You go from one thing to a new thing. In musical terms, that is, you have actually left that particular melody and you've arrived at a completely new melody, so you would now have at least 2 melodies. Okay? And the third form of deterritorialization is also an absolute form, but this is the form that is sort of leading towards death. It's the line of abolition. So this is the absolute deterritorialization. And this is the one around which Deleuze and Guattari say you must be cautious. So your territory, to go back again, your territory is produced or manifests itself as an assemblage, but the space it marks out is on your body without organs. Okay? So your territory has a physical manifestation. Okay? You know, if you're standing too close to somebody, you feel that your territory has been encroached and so forth. Okay? But in actual fact, that feeling takes place in your head, as it were, and it impacts on issues to do with your sense of yourself and so on and so forth. Okay, so it has a physical manifestation. It's realized through an assemblage. The assemblage is always material in that sense, but it stands on your body without organs, and that's where it's experienced. So in other words, your deterritorialization takes place on your body without organs. Okay. So therefore you deterritorialize on your body without organs because, remember we talked about the body without organs as being a sense of pure possibility. If that pure possibility starts to feel constrained, in other words, when you start to feel territorial, then what you want to do is to reconfigure your territory or leave your territory. So when you actually leave your territory, then, Deleuze and Guattari say, you want to re-territorialize. Okay? And they suggest that we always re-territorialize on that which is elsewhere the most deterritorialized. Therefore, it's available for us to re-territorialize on. Yeah, I'll try. This is one of the more complicated things that they have to talk about. So we deterritorialize as we leave our territory. We re-territorialize on something else that is the most deterritorialized. Okay? So something that has already been deterritorialized. If we go back to my example of Christianity, right? So Christianity as a religion has, over the past couple of thousand years, been deterritorialized in many, many kinds of ways. Okay? If you look at the transition towards Protestantism, as Weber writes about it, one of the things that Weber says is that once Protestants took hold of the idea that you could be godly in the things that you were doing in your work, then you didn't actually need to go to church in order to be godly, because being godly took place inside you, not inside a building. So in other words, you left the church becomes deterritorialized, it's no longer your territory, and you have re-territorialized on yourself as now a fully deterritorialized or available for a new kind of investment. So we could see that as a model of what it looks like to deterritorialize and to re-territorialize, to leave the physical confines of the church and arrive at the kind of spiritual center of the body of consciousness and so forth. And Jameson refers to this as the sort of vanishing mediator, but we could see it as deterritorialization and re-territorialization. And there's been various analyses, particularly in the US, trying to understand the rise of various forms of quite ultra-right but also orthodox Christianity. And one of the arguments, and I'm not saying this is necessarily a cogent argument, but it's one that's illustrative, is that, you know, as their daily life, their jobs and so forth come under pressure, they start to feel threatened in that respect, that their security of employment is, as it were, deterritorialized, and their identity associated with that, they re-territorialize onto you know, more orthodox forms of religion as a new source of intellectual solidarity and well-being and so forth. I don't know if I necessarily believe that argument, and so I'm not putting it out there as any kind of an explanation. It's simply an illustration of the kinds of things that we're trying to utilize with respect to the idea of territory. Okay. Now, how do we arrive at territory? What is the difference between something that is territory and what is not territory? So the not territory is referred to by Deleuze and Guattari as the milieu. Okay, milieu. So milieu is one of those words in French which of course can be translated in a number of different ways. One of the ways by which it can be translated is as the middle. So when Janae was quoting yesterday where Deleuze and Guattari say everything takes place in the middle, one could also have translated that as everything takes place in the milieu. Okay, and in fact that's what it is in French anyway. So everything takes place in the milieu, but the milieu is something that lacks boundaries and lacks definition until we begin to think about it. So Deleuze and Guattari say that there are three types of milieu: interior, exterior, and what they call associated or anterior. Okay. So the interior milieu is in sort of ethological terms, you might think of it as the Umwelt, your life world. Okay, if you do phenomenology or Schutzer or something like that, the Umwelt, the life world, this is your interior milieu. Your interior milieu always has around it the exterior milieu, but the exterior milieu is not simply, you know, the outside. It's not, which is like, you know, if my house is my interior milieu, then the street is the exterior milieu. No, the exterior milieu should be understood as that which would threaten and cause your interior milieu to fall apart. Okay. So your exterior milieu is the limit of your interior milieu. But you shouldn't try to understand this in physical terms. Don't draw a circle, this is the interior, that's the exterior, in my house is interior, the street is exterior. It's not like that at all. The interior is your life world. What kinds of things could interrupt it? Well, you know, if you're a rabbit and, you know, you're sitting there being a happy little rabbit, thinking I'm kind of cute, got my little bunny tail, everything's kind of rocking in my world, and then along comes a fox and it eats you, then that's your exterior milieu, right? There are predators, there are things that are going to kind of mess with your day. So as you're trying to think about what exterior milieu looks like, those are the things that would impact on your interior milieu. So within 21st century life, it would be, you know, things like your job, your position within the economy, the caste system, etc., etc. All of these things are part of the exterior milieu. They are present in the interior, but they are the exterior because they could change and do change the formation of the interior. Now the third form, the anterior, if you like, or the associated, Deleuze and Guattari define in terms of sources of energy. So one of the ways they talk about it is in terms of being like oxygen for the animal. No oxygen, you die, right? If we were to then try to transpose this into trying to think about social life, you know, what kinds of things would count as the sources of energy for social life that you might want to map? Well, you could quite literally map it in terms of actual energy flows, like how different would your life look in the absence of electricity? How different does your life look in the absence of certain calorie flows, or certain financial flows, and so on. Now this notion of flow is of course also quite important to Deleuze and Guattari, but bear in mind that flow for them is actually the word fluid, and is translated as flight sometimes, as flow sometimes, but it could also be translated as flux, and in some ways flux is a better way of understanding it, because when you encounter the flux, what you encounter is something that dissolves you. So an encounter with a flow is not an encounter with something that has no consequence to you, or that you just simply, you know, take bits out of at will. It's to encounter something that has a disruptive power to you. Okay, and you know, money, calories, all these things have a disruptive power. You have lots of money, it disrupts your life just as surely as if you have very little money. Okay. So that's the interior, exterior, and associated milieu. Now the territory sits on top of that. Okay. So this is where we get to the idea of a sort of semiotic within Deleuze and Guattari. And the difference, they say, is that in the milieu, signs are directional. In the territory, or what brings about or what creates the territory, is their transformation to become dimensional. Okay? Directional signs becoming dimensional signs. So think about this, just to give you an ordinary example. You get up in the morning and you make yourself a cup of coffee. You're sitting there and you're thinking, I'm really looking forward to drinking my cup of coffee. But, you know, lo and behold, you manage to accidentally knock your cup of coffee on the floor, cup smashes, coffee's everywhere. And your reaction is not, oh shit, I dropped my cup of coffee, but my life is ruined. Now, a big kind of leap, right? But a not unfamiliar leap. So, directional to dimensional. Directional, drop the coffee cup, damn it, I broke the coffee cup. Merely directional. Dimensional, drop the coffee cup, my life is ruined. I'm a loser. Why does this keep happening to me? The way by which you're responding to it is completely disproportionate to what is actually happening. But more importantly, what I'm trying to suggest is it's a semiotic shift. First of all, you're looking at it as something that is, you know, merely a direction, and then secondly, it's dimensional. And this is what film does. This is what literature does. All most forms of the aesthetic are, from Deleuze and Guattari's point of view, precisely aimed at shifting from directional to dimensional. Directional is not the realm of art. Dimensional is the realm of art. Okay, so Deleuze and Guattari say, yes, animals make posters. They say, here I am, come and look at me. That's not yet art. It becomes art when those posters become dimensional and they start to say something more than simply I'm here, but they start to say not only am I here and I'm available, but let's make a match and so on and so forth. So you have a transformation in how those semiotics are responding. So that's why Deleuze and Guattari say they think it's perfectly feasible to say that animals produce the first form of art. Okay, if we understand art as a shift from the directional to the dimensional. Okay. And that then is the realm, if you're doing film studies, you're doing literary studies, that's where you should be looking at the dimensional, that shift from directional to dimensional. And it means then that most forms of Saussurean semiotics don't really cut the mustard, because they keep trying to take you back to something that is actually fundamentally directional in its way of approaching. But if you think about it, there is no semiotic leap to be made from I dropped my coffee cup to my life is ruined. There is no semiotic reference there. You can't say that's the referent to that as your signified. It doesn't make any kind of sense. So what they're effectively saying is that we need a different model of semiotics. Okay? And that's why they turn more to Peirce and move away from Saussure. The other thing that they do is to see this in terms of the idea of an incorporeal transformation, which they take from Austin and the notion of the performative. So what is an incorporeal transformation? The incorporeal transformation is whereby language is able to bring about a change in the world simply through the performance or the utterance of that language. So the standard example is when the priest, the minister, whoever says, I now pronounce you husband and wife, or as is now possible in Australia, wife and wife. From that moment, because of the utterance of that phrase, your situation has been transformed, it has been changed, but your physical body remains the same, so it is an incorporeal transformation. Okay? And so for Deleuze and Guattari, this is the basis of their semiotic. What they're interested in is this incorporeal transformation. Okay? And I was talking about this the other day when we were talking about notions of lack and so forth, and one of the things I'm saying was suggesting is that this lack, if we understand it as an incorporeal transformation, is much more powerful than simply trying to say, well, I lack this thing. Okay, to embody this idea is to be changed by it. Now, this then is one half of the assemblage. Okay, so the assemblage has a territorial dimension, which is also referred to as the expressive dimension. And then the other part of the assemblage is the machinic dimension, or the bodily or the content or the material dimension, which then gives rise to, or can be thought about in terms of, the machinic phylum. So when we're trying to talk about the assemblage then, we have to talk about it as something that has two types of components. Okay? And to simplify things, but bear in mind I'm simplifying, and you shouldn't take this as being the exact gospel, but it's a simplification that helps us. We can say that the assemblage must always consist of, or always does consist of, a sort of machinic dimension of bodies and an expressive dimension of signs. Okay? So one of the ways by which I have written about it, and if you look on my academia edu site, you'll see I've got some papers called assemblage theory this and assemblage theory that. So I'll give you an example from there. In one of them, I'm talking about indigenous housing in Australia, which is housing not just for poor people, but for people who are living in remote areas and so on. And there was a building program some years ago, nearly 10 years ago now, where the government sort of said, we're going to spend $900 million to build houses for these particular poor people. It sounded fabulous. The government, it was an amazing thing to them to say, until someone pointed out, but to build the kind of houses that you're claiming you're going to build, it's going to cost approximately $2 million per house to build, and it's therefore you're only going to build 450 houses. And the government was like, whoa, we can't really go to the people and say we're spending $2 million per house to build houses for poor people, because all our middle class voters in Sydney and so forth are going to say, well, I want a $2 million house too. Can I be poor too? Can I have my $2 million house? But since they'd announced that they were going to build it, they were now on the hook to build it. So their solution was to ask the question, what constitutes a house? What is the absolute bare minimum of a house that would still be a house? Okay. Now, Australia doesn't have slums like you have in India, so this question is quite a difficult question to ask within India. But if you were a development worker and you're looking at a slum, are you not effectively asking the same question? Recognizing all kinds of material constraints, you are fundamentally saying, what is the bare minimum that should be present in a slum? What is the bare minimum that you can say, well, they're not living in $2 million houses, but at least they have the cornerstones of what we consider to be sufficient for life. So the same kinds of questions were raised with respect to these indigenous houses. Does it need to be connected to sewerage? Does it need to be connected to electricity? Does it need to be connected to running water? Does it need to be air conditioned? Does it need to be insulated? How big does it actually need to be? So on and so on and so on. Okay? Now all of this belongs to what I would call the machinic phylum of the house, because this is the physical dimensions of the house, but at the same time it's a set of theoretical questions around what are the absolute limits of the house, or the absolute limits of our idea of housing, to the point at which we can say, when is a house not a house? Okay? And in this particular example, it was said, well, look, if you've got a house built in the middle of nowhere that's not connected to electricity, water, or the sewage, it ain't a house. It's a tin shed. And if you then complain about Indigenous people not wanting to live in it, then you really kind of need to have your head read, because nobody would want to live in that. So we then have the second dimension, which is the expressive dimension, or you might say the discursive dimension, because then you have all the questions around, well, who says this is legitimate? Who says this is an appropriate sort of house for people to live in? And who says these people should be allowed to live there even though nobody else would want to live there, right? The same is true in India. Who should be living in slums and who shouldn't be living in slums? It's okay for those people to live in slums, but it's not okay for those people to live in slums. That's your expressive dimension. That's the dimension of discourse, of semiotics. So when we're thinking about the assemblage, it's a combination of those two things. A machinic phylum of material realities on the ground that are there as a product of all kinds of discursive questions. And it's a sort of, Deleuze and Crowley actually talk about it as a kind of discursive cloud that floats over the top of all that, that are the ways by which we think about it, integrate with it, debate it. It's the plane on which the debates take place of, whether this is appropriate or not appropriate, and so on. I wrote about this in my paper, so you can go back and check that out, and it'll give you a clearer account. All right, bearing in mind that we're going to finish at 1 o'clock, I'm going to stop talking. We have precisely 9 minutes for questions. So if you've got a question, keep it short, and I'll try to answer it for you. Off the back. Short answer, yes, within the horizon of imagination. It must be, yep.
Right. And the second is, how do we see the relation of ascesis to your plane of immanence? Because death is that plane of transcendence, right? So how do we see? Because we are creating the moral spaces, the controls, the laws within those planes of immanence, right? So is death that plane of transcendence? Does it offer that?
Yeah, look, that's a super complicated question. So the short answer would be, if we take away this idea of transcendence and simply substitute the assemblage as being transcendent in the plane of eminence, or on the plane of eminence, if you like, then it consists of these two dimensions of a sort of discursive dimension, which would be where the moral kinds of questions and debates would take place alongside the physical attribute. So there's no short way of answering your question, but that's how I would answer it.
Simply put, is death a part of, would you consider death as a part of the life world, the fundamental life world? Is it a part of the life world? Because
Is death part of the life world?
Part of life, yeah.
It seems almost like an oxymoronic question, I have to say. What is it with you guys and death? No one asks me questions about sex or something interesting like that. It's death, death, death. Come on, guys, lighten up. The sensuality of death. Now we get it. Right. The short answer is it has to be, right? I mean, it must be in some way part of it. But the question is, in what way is it part of it? And so this is kind of the answer that I was giving the other day, that, who was it that mentioned Blanchot? So they take from Blanchot the idea, the notion of the two deaths, the death of the physical body and also the death of, if you like, the discursive body. So in that sense, it's more the second death, the death of the sort of discursive body, that is part of the realm of the life world. Okay, enough on that one. Another question? Yeah.
Is deterioration a continuous process? That's one. And two, how would you place a migrant, a post-migrant, or a refugee, or an exile who are forcefully deteriorized from their territory in this schema?
Well, that's an interesting question. So the first question is deterritorializing constant? The short answer is you wouldn't want it to be. Because if leaving your territory is a disruptive, potentially fatal kind of a process, then you don't want to be constantly leaving your territory. But neither do you want to be constantly stuck in your territory. So what Deleuze and Guattari talk about as being like a model of health is to be constantly able to leave your territory. And for Guattari, his definition of pathology is to be stuck. To be stuck, to be unable to leave your territory. So no, it's not constant. You wouldn't want it to be. If it was, you would experience that as a form of psychosis. But by the same token, if you couldn't leave your territory, if you felt stuck, you would also experience that as a sort of process of neurosis, or even maybe a sort of catatonic psychosis as well. The second question with regard to refugees, asylum seekers and migrants and so forth, I mean, the answer to that is going to be complicated, because certainly as you leave your territory, you take with you a whole set of new territorial coordinates, right? You're highly concerned about your security, you're concerned about your livelihood, and all those are territorial questions. So I don't think you leave your territory behind. If anything, your territory or your territorializing modalities have become much more active than they ever were before, but probably they are now more narrow in the range of their concerns, because now you're not interested in art and that sort of thing. You're interested in, am I going to survive until tomorrow? Okay, one and then one. So one here.
What constitutes territory in this excessively mobile and global world? Everything seems to be in flux. So, what kind of coordinates which you can say is defining territory? Are they geographical? Or, geography is not that in flux, but still, certainly cultural and social and all those things are continuously in flux.
Yeah, but isn't that kind of what we're saying with respect to Facebook, right? I mean, every time you switch Facebook on, that's a territorializing act, because you're immediately entering into a world that is constructed in your image. It's your friends putting up things that you find funny, and the reason why it's kind of a comfortable place for you to go is precisely because it is a territory. So one might say that the more turbulent things become at the material level of everyday life, the more important these kinds of re-territorializing opportunities that are accessed via social media, the more important they become. Okay, one behind.
What role do performatives play?
Performatives?
Performatives play
Yep.
in the shift from directional to dimensional. What role do performative utterances play in the shift from directional to dimensional?
Okay, so they don't play a role in the sense that there's no such thing as a directional performative. There's only a dimensional performative. So the transition from directional to dimensional takes place because of the performative. So there is no performative form of the directional. There is only a performative form of the dimensional. And so in the transition from that to that, we can say that a performative has taken place. One of the really interesting things in Deleuze and Guattari's discussions of semiotics is to try to move away from the idea that it's, as it were, only language that is performative, that there are other forms of performative, or that performatives can take other forms, or more subtle forms than simply the notion of the command or the order. And one of the ways they talk about it, which is perhaps central, is that the very phrase, when you say, I am, is a performative. It is a transformation of a set of inchoate kind of feelings, a sort of pre-individual and so forth, transformed into the illusion of the I. So they're suggesting that the performative can actually take place within the space of the psyche and does not have to take the form of a specific kind of a command or language instruction. All right, one more question, if we have one. Yeah? So I'm not sure if I'm hearing the question correctly. You're asking, how does digital technology... So I must apologize. I have a slight hearing... I have a slight hearing loss, so it's a little bit difficult for me to hear. But you're saying that digital technology causes a paradigm shift? That's the first part.
Just asking question related to our topic, sir. Like technology is playing critical role in all these transformations.
Yep.
So my question is that technology has emerged a new paradigm, and this new paradigm is how going to be effective for that vertical territorial shift.
Oh, how does new technology function for territory?
How can communicate technology with territorial shift?
Okay, so is that kind of what I was saying with respect to Facebook, is that technology is enabling or creating a new kind of a territory?
For urban space.
For urban space? Well, I mean, it's a difficult kind of question to answer, but I mean, if you think about the idea of the screen and people's use of the screen, I haven't been on public transport in the inner cities of India, so on the subways and so forth. But if you look at the subways, like I've been on the subway in Seoul, for example, or in Sydney, and like everybody on the train has a cell phone, everybody is looking at a screen, and every kind of major downtown area in Seoul, for example, has free Wi-Fi. So therefore your relation to the urban space is mediated via your cell phone at all times. Okay, that people are looking at the screen rather than looking at the space. And the urban space is beginning to be transformed to reflect the fact that people are looking at the screen. So for example, look, I'm going to tell you right now, my prediction for the next generation mobile phone, get in now because you're going to be rich, it's going to be a see-through phone. And if you're wondering why, it's like I have to stand up to do it, it's because of this. Like people are dying, right? I mean, they're dying because they don't look up. I mean, in Australia now we've got lines painted on the ground that says, look up, there's cars. But when they have a see-through phone, you won't have to give up on your phone. You can keep looking at people and they'll think you're talking to them, but you're not because you're looking at your phone. So the way the screen is mediating urban space is something that we have barely begun to map. But it's pretty clear that we're going to start modifying the urban space because we're making sure that Wi-Fi is available. We're making it possible for people to walk and look at the screen at the same time. So, I mean, there's a very, very minimal kinds of answers to your question, but that's sort of where I would go with it. But listen, we are out of time, so thank you all very much for a wonderful week. And I look forward to seeing